Howdy folks, welcome to the Daily Coin. My name is Rory, and today is Wednesday, March the 23rd, 2016, and I have the great honor and distinct pleasure of welcoming back to the show Mr. Jeff Nielson, who is writer over at Sprott Money, and he has his own website, bullionbullscanada.com. Jeff, how you doing today?
I'm doing fine, Rory. It's always very interesting when we get a chance to sit down and talk, and I'm sure today will be no different.
I'm sure of that. So we're going to just jump right in, and here we go. The largest Hindu temple in the world has agreed to turn over 7 tons of gold. They've already made a deposit of 1.3 tons, and that was on a
tons now. Okay,
yeah,
we're up
it was 1.3 tons, and they agreed to a 3-year term.
Okay, so this is definitely escalating because, of course, the original thing I heard was 100 pounds. 100 pounds.
No, this was just released by, like I said, by Reuters, and the second leg is to deposit 1.4 tons for between 3 and 15 years. But the catch is that the temple has said, we'll do that, but we don't want money. We want gold. So they're giving a lot of pushback. Here's the opening paragraph. The world's richest Hindu temple is asking to be repaid in gold for longer-term deposits it makes under the Indian government's monetization scheme in order to make the plan more attractive to the temples that are sitting on thousands of tons of metal. The Swami Temple, popularly known as Tiruthupa, has requested repayment of their deposits on longer than 3 years under the gold monetization scheme in the metal rather than cash, the executive director told Reuters on Wednesday. So if it's more than 3 years, we want metal. We don't want your rupees because they're worthless. And I want to read this last part, and then you can reply if you would.
Sure.
It says the temple will deposit. No, wait a minute. TTD, which there is the temple, last month deposited 1.3 tons of gold with the state-run national bank at a rate of 1.75% for 3 years. And then the temple will deposit another 1.4 tons in a fortnight at 1.25% with the Indian Overseas Bank, as most of the gold is raw and the bank will spend to refine it. That's the deposit that's in question. The temple they want gold is the bottom line. They want gold as for payment instead of cash for the deposit of their gold.
Well, Rory, this is almost too funny. And it's just a matter of where do we start? Going back to what we've talked about before with this gold deposit scam, the reason we knew it was fraud right from the instant it was announced is because of what the bankers have been telling us for years and years and years, quote unquote, gold generates no income. So of course, the moment anybody offers to, quote unquote, pay interest on something that generates no income, we're dealing with fraud. There could never be a legitimate purpose to enter into a transaction where you borrow something that generates no income but pay interest on it. So we start with the basic fraudulent premise. So now, of course, the original scheme is you deposit your gold and you get paid paper interest. And of course, that was a really good laugh because the gold is valuable. The gold exists in very finite quantities. The paper is worthless. The paper exists in infinite quantities. Give us something valuable and we'll give you a little bit of something worthless in return. Ha, ha, ha. So now we get to this new wrinkle. And of course, it's still obvious fraud because if you can't even pay paper interest on gold, how could you ever pay gold interest on gold? Is the government of India planning on doing with the gold it takes on deposit? Is it going to plant it in the ground and grow gold trees? Because
It's a good
unless it's
question.
going to unless it's going to do that, it cannot pay gold interest, quote unquote, on the deposited gold. So we're at an even more ludicrous level of fraud. But then, in addition to this, we also have the time element, which you carefully pointed out, that this requirement of paying gold interest only occurs with respect to longer term deposits going out 3 years and beyond. So there's either one of two ways of looking at this. Either this scam is only intended to last for 3 years, and they're going to steal as much gold as they can during that window, and then announce when people start to expect their gold interest that, oh yeah, sorry, there's nothing left in the kitty. Or the other possibility is that the temple itself is complicit in this and is simply uh, agreeing to this transaction, knowing the terms will never be honored down the road.
So they're just playing along to get along.
Yeah,
They've been handed something in the back that is not, or in the background that is not being discussed.
well, and of course, it could be either a bribe or it could be intimidation. As you know from before, when the Indian government discussed prying some gold out of the temples, their idea was to, quote unquote, send in the bankers.
Exactly.
So, apparently they're considered to be extremely persuasive, and we all know how the big banks like to engage in persuasion.
Yeah. What gets me is that you keep referring to it as a scam, and it's a scheme, Jeff. It's the gold monetization scheme. That's the name of the program. I
Well,
mean,
and of course, I've had a good laugh at that on many occasions, pointing out that the conspirators couldn't even invent a more reputable sounding name for their scam than to call it a scheme. And I marveled at that. You know, who has the audacity to propose something which is openly fraudulent on its very surface and then title it a scheme?
exactly. I mean, it's how can I mean they may as well just call it, the gold monetization fraud.
Or are the we steal gold?
We steal gold. Oh my goodness, which is pretty much what's happening. And I want to kind of look at silver for a minute. There seems to be a lot of chatter about silver recently, and in particular about silver going much higher during 2016. And what does your research show, Jeff? I mean, are you on board with that idea, or how do you see silver playing out in the short term, being the next few months, or the more longer term being the rest of the year?
Well, I look at this as being, once again, totally surreal. Uh, as you know, my own prognosis on what's taking place currently in bullion markets over the short term is that we're in the middle of a fake rally. And my premise for that is really simple. As we've seen metals prices advance, the price of gold has been leading the price of silver. But in any legitimate precious metals rally, the price of silver always leads the price of gold. This is a rule of precious metals markets for a very simple reason, because by dollar value, the silver market is much, much smaller than the gold market. So it only requires a microscopic amount of capital in proportion to push the silver price higher. And given current parameters, with the current gold-silver price ratio at an ultra-absurd 80-to-1 level, that means that if only 2% of the money entering this sector was going into silver, silver would have to lead the way as a matter of simple arithmetic. Meanwhile, as you recently pointed out in an interview with the esteemed Eric Sprott, in the real world, with real physical silver, we see silver being purchased at a 50-to-1 ratio to gold. In other words, far more than just 2% of the money going into silver. We see well over 25% of the money going into silver.
And
So
that
not
and
only,
that's held for some time now. It's
yeah,
been
and
at that level for a long time.
exactly. This is an established trend that at least 25% of the money going into the sector is going into silver. And at one point, when things really heated up a year or so ago, the total amount of money going into physical silver was actually greater than the total amount of money going into physical gold. So when we see the bankers' fraudulent paper markets and we're told gold is leading the way, implying that less than 2% of the money entering that sector is going into silver, I say that's obvious fraud. And of course, the motive for the fraud is, as your audience probably remembers from our prior chats, I'm convinced that the next crash is nearly upon us. And the last thing the bankers want to do is to allow gold and silver to be seen as a safe haven. So those markets will be crashed with everything else.
Now,
However,
are we seeing that today? Because I mean, they're hitting gold and silver have been hit pretty substantially. I mean, gold is currently down almost $24, which is close to 2%, and then silver is down over 60 cents an ounce, which is about 4%.
I pondered that question when I looked at metals prices this morning. And my internal answer was, I don't know. And it's simply a matter of we can't judge off of one day. It is definitely a possibility that this minute rally we've seen is going to be the high point for metals prices, and then they're going to launch their crash. As I was going to add a minute ago, the reason it's important to march metals prices higher over the short term, even though they're planning on crashing them, is because of that fact. If you want to crash metals prices, but they're already at bargain basement levels, then you have to march them up a bit first if you want to give them a really good crash. So it's take them up so you can push them down even harder and faster. And maybe that harder and faster push down is starting today. My sense is that it's still a little premature. My sense is this will be a false takedown, if you will, and then we'll see metals prices quickly bounce up again and resume their pseudo rally. And the actual takedown will occur a few weeks further down the road. But here, I mean, this is getting into the realm of speculation. It's certainly a possibility that the takedown could have started today, but I suspect a more likely time frame would be about 4 to 6 weeks from now.
Now, what is that based on?
Well, my anticipation for the next crash itself is sometime between April and June. The crash in metals prices could occur slightly prior to that, so that the sheep in markets are able to see gold and silver falling first, and then right after that everything falls. Or the crashes could occur concurrently and just everything goes down together. Either one of those scenarios would suit the bankers' agenda. So if they want the metals prices to go down slightly ahead of the overall crash, then that could be what we're seeing today. But I think it suits their plans equally to have everything go down together, because then they don't have to explain why metals prices are going down. Instead, they can just wait for the panic and then invent any old reason they want when people have stopped thinking.
Okay, that makes sense. And so you see this being tied to all of the commodities market, the equities markets. What are you referencing there as far as the bigger crash?
Of course, precious metals are commodities themselves.
Right.
And what we've seen in this bubble and crash cycle, which is different from the bubble and crash cycle of 2001 to 2008, is that in that previous cycle, we saw commodities prices entering a spiral just before the crash began. What we've seen in this bubble and crash cycle is, if you go back to 2011, we had commodity markets heating up again, and left alone, they would have gone into an even greater spiral because, of course, as we know, the money printing has been far more extreme and excessive in this bubble and crash cycle. It's the money printing that creates inflation, and of course that inflation is supposed to translate directly into the prices of hard assets. So in 2011, by the time they finally had their HFT trading manipulation fully perfected, they took that to commodities markets, and they took the entire commodity spectrum down, marched it steadily lower. And in fact, I wrote a prior piece on that where we can see all commodity markets moving upward in a trend up to 2011. And then even while we're supposedly being told that our economies are quote unquote recovering, we see all the commodity markets being marched downward for no valid fundamental reason. It simply was because suppressing the commodity prices not only helps to hide the general inflation trend, but suppressing the prices themselves reduces actual inflation since these commodities are inputs into all of our manufacturing. Of course, they suppress the price of commodity inputs, and as we also know, wages are being suppressed. In real dollars, wages keep going lower and lower. So if you manipulate input prices lower, and if you manipulate wages lower, then the price for finished goods is also much lower than it would be legitimately. So this is another way to hide inflation, is by artificially reducing the price of finished goods through this extreme campaign of manipulation.
When Dave and I interviewed Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, he was saying that John Williams over at Shadow Stats is reporting inflation at about 8.4%, which is a far cry from the 2% or less that we are fed. Personally, I think that it's even higher than that. I mean, I know that his model looks at everything, whereas I'm just looking at the things that are in my house, and the things that are in my house seem to be on a slightly higher trend than 8.4%.
Well, let me address that from two different perspectives. First of all, there's of course one other manipulation factor which enters into this equation, which I didn't discuss earlier, and that's the manipulation of currencies. So, of course, in your case, it's a positive variable. The US dollar has been manipulated to an ultra extreme level, and that's another way of suppressing inflation within the US economy. Make your currency ridiculously overpriced, and then everything else looks cheaper in comparison. So, from that perspective, I would say, well, put your faith in John Williams' numbers. But of course, what it means for people in Canada, where I am, and elsewhere in the West, is that inflation is much worse because our currencies are taking on the chin, falling and have fallen at a precipitous rate, and thus definitely inflation outside of the U.S. is far, far above that 8.4% level. But let me also address one other somewhat smaller point with respect to John Williams' work. And of course, once again, we both know he's a scrupulously honest individual, so there's no possible question at all of him fudging numbers.
Exactly.
But at the same time, I see a slight bias in his work, a totally inadvertent bias, and it's simply because of the fact that his methodology is to always calculate statistics in the same way they've always been calculated. That's how he produces his own consistency. And of course, that's part of the reason his work is valid. Except when it comes to inflation, in order to calculate the correct rate of inflation, you have to start with a correct basket of goods. Because that's what the inflation calculation is based upon. It's based upon a fixed basket of goods rather than all of the goods that exist in the universe. Because of course, it would be impossible to construct an index that broad. So no matter who's calculating inflation, whether it's the liars in government or someone honest like John Williams, they have to choose a basket of goods. So John Williams' approach has been to use the same basket that was used 30, 40 years ago. And of course, there's obvious reasons for him doing so to maintain validity in his work. But at the same time, the problem with that approach is that between 30 years and now, the standard of living for most of the people in the Western world has fallen precipitously. And what that translates into is that our basket of goods that we're purchasing today is significantly different than the basket of goods that was being purchased in years past. Specifically, a much higher percentage of our diminishing incomes goes into food and housing versus any previous time in our societies when, as a more affluent population, we only required a much smaller portion of our incomes to go to food and housing. So instead of it being, say, 30% 30 years ago, for the average person, it's probably more like 60% today. So if you do not weight the basket of goods more heavily in favor of food and shelter today, then your basket will not be accurate. more particularly, as we know, it is food and shelter prices that have soared in an insane spiral over the last 30 years, while the prices for other goods have been more modest because of the dynamics I was mentioning to you previously. So, in order for a basket of goods to be a perfectly accurate gauge of inflation today, that basket must be altered to include a lot more food items and a much larger shelter component than the basket of years gone by. And so, in that respect, John Williams' calculation, although it's entirely honest, would understate US inflation for most people to a certain degree because most people spend much more on food than what is implied by the basket of goods that John Williams uses in his calculation.
And that makes perfect sense. And that's why the comment that I made a moment ago, as far as what I'm experiencing in my home, I'm equating that to food specifically.
Yeah, you have a real basket. You go out to shop in the real world and you fill up your real basket, and that basket is not the same one that John Williams is basing his calculation upon. So your observations of the world around you are honest and accurate. John Williams's calculation is honest and accurate as far as it goes, but it's based upon a basket that does not apply to as many people as it used to.
Now, the example you used was, 30 years ago, the housing and food made up 30%, and today it makes up 60%. I mean, I know that was just for demonstration, but how would that impact the overall? I mean, as far as what John Williams, the numbers that he uses, and this is not intended as an attack on his work at all, so please don't anyone think that. That's not what we're doing. But it was, if it is 50% or 100% higher, which is what you're saying, would that translate to, instead of it being 8.4, it would be like 17?
No, definitely not. We're
Okay.
definitely talking about a much more subtle bias here. So it's not like the difference between U.S. inflation and Canadian inflation. It's more along the lines of perhaps his calculation is 20% below where it should be, perhaps 25% below. The thing is here, as you know, Rory, I'm the anti-economist.
The anti-economist.
So I don't work in sort of the careful, methodical manner of a John Williams. Here's somebody who meticulously goes to the raw data and collects it all himself and spends an enormous amount of time in the data collection process. And I salute him for that because we need that work to be done or we would have no reference points at all to work with. My own approach, is a lot more ad hoc. I'm a big picture guy, so I base my own analysis more on trends and to some extent generalities. So I am not precisely familiar with the basket of goods John Williams is using, so I could not say to you, well, Rory, his calculation should be 15% higher than it is. In other words, it should be about 10%, or it should be 25% higher, so it should be about 11 or 12%. It's a matter of there's a slight understatement in his accounting because of the difference in baskets of goods, but I don't think it's a huge difference. And so it's more along those lines of it feels worse to you because it is worse, but there's not a huge gulf between John Williams's estimates versus your own perceptions at this point.
Gotcha.
I suspect the gulf will grow greater as our standard of living falls further and our basket of goods is skewed even more heavily towards food and shelter, but that's going to be an ongoing process. So for instance, if we go back 5 years ago, there would have been a very, very small bias in John Williams's basket of goods. That bias is slowly and steadily growing over time.
I wanted to change gears completely. The attack just happened in Brussels, Belgium yesterday. When I first heard about it, the only thing I could think was another false flag. And whether it pans out that way, more than likely it will. How do you see the remainder of 2016 playing out as far as the economy, as far as what Trump and Sanders are doing with the presidential election, the U.S. presidential election? and bringing all of these people, all of these very angry people into the fold, and the situation that happened in Brussels. I mean, I don't see all of these as being disconnected. I see them as all being very connected.
No, and my own perspective is very similar, and my approach is the same approach that we're always supposed to take whenever we look at any sort of crime. The exact approach that our law enforcement officials take when they look at any sort of crime. And the first question they ask themselves is, who has the motive? And of course, one of the best ways to determine who has the motive for any crime is to ask the second question, who benefits the most from that crime? And of course, when it comes to any of these so-called quote-unquote terrorist attacks, there is only one entity or collection of entities that we can see who benefits from these attacks, and it's our own governments. Because every time they tell us there's another terrorist attack, what comes immediately after that is more of their fascist laws. Oh, we need to pass these laws to protect you. How convenient. If there weren't any terrorist attacks, there would be no pretext for all of this extra protection, quote unquote.
Right.
So, I mean, it's hard to illustrate a motive that's any more obvious than that. And of course, this is why the false flag attack has been a standard tool for governments going back centuries, and no government more than the United States. So, this is why it frustrates me that the concept of the false flag attack is still something that penetrates the general public very, very little, if at all. There's such an obvious reason for governments to engage in this sort of heinous deceptive behavior. It's happened over and over again throughout history. Why aren't people looking at it today? Well, of course, we can answer that in one word: brainwashing.
There you have it. Now, are we setting the table for the cover-up of the collapse? Is that what we're seeing with Paris just a few months ago, and now Brussels, which Paris was obviously, and I have to say, anytime that I hear the word ISIS, the first thing that I think is CIA, because who created ISIS? Who funds, trains, and arms ISIS? The CIA, period. It's well documented. And so when I hear that, it's like, okay. And like I said, Paris, and now Belgium, a little bit bigger. And I personally believe that something else even slightly larger is coming within the next 60 to 90 days, which has been about that same time frame since Paris happened. And that we're building toward these criminals to unleash something much larger in order to cover up the actual crime of collapsing the system.
I certainly agree with what you're saying and fear what you're saying. But let me just add a little bit to what you were saying about ISIS, because it's more than just a matter of this large and mounting pile of evidence that shows that ISIS was a deliberate construction of the U.S. government. What we're seeing here is the repetition of a pattern. And all we have to do is go back to Afghanistan, go back 30 years to when the Soviet Union originally invaded Afghanistan, at which time the CIA created the Mujahideen to act as freedom fighters, quote unquote, and guerrilla fighters against the Russians. Because, of course, when you carry out terrorist attacks against the Russians, you're not a terrorist, you're a freedom fighter. So the war in Russia ends, and then all of a sudden, the Mujahideen are rebranded as, quote unquote, Al-Qaeda. Well, they were on the CIA payroll right up to the day they became Al-Qaeda. Is there any reason for us to expect they left the payroll? Well, of course not, given that they performed an incredibly useful function for the U.S. government, which people know today as 9/11. So what we're seeing here is an exact duplication of that pattern. We know that the original funding of these thugs and mercenaries came from the U.S. government. We see the pattern that's led from that point. Originally, they were once again freedom fighters. They were freedom fighters when they were in Libya. And originally, they were even supposed to be freedom fighters when they were in Syria. And then at some rather nebulous point, all of a sudden, they're the enemy again. And it's the exact same Mujahideen to Al Qaeda transformation we saw in the previous cycle, except it's a little bit muddier.
Well, but in Libya is when Al Qaeda morphed into ISIS, and Al Qaeda became our friend, and ISIS became our enemy. And then it got really disturbing and very muddy when ISIS was walking across Iraq, slaughtering people in city after city. And with all of the U.S. military that is still in Iraq, the question becomes how is that even possible without somebody saying let this pass, let these guys pass? I mean, there was about 10,000 of them at that time. 10 to 12,000 were the numbers. This was 2 years ago, maybe not even. I mean, it's ridiculous.
Unfortunately, we got an answer to that question from Russia. Russia surprised the West. They moved their own forces into Syria. They launched their own attacks against ISIS and immediately rolled back this paper tiger. So, what we saw was Russia being able to, in a matter of weeks, deploy its forces into a new theater and immediately chalk up decisive victories against these supposedly invincible terrorists whom the U.S. Army was supposedly impotent in fighting. And so, as you say, this is absolutely farcical. How could the world's only superpower be completely impotent against a band of lightly armed thugs, but yet Russia could roll in its creaking and decrepit war machine and immediately roll them back? There's no logical answer for that. It was yet another illustration of this totally false paradigm. The only way that ISIS could survive with the U.S. Army standing around watching it is if the U.S. Army was standing around watching it, if not actively helping it.
Exactly. I mean, and I'm glad that you said that, because that's the other part that is, even to the most illiterate person out there, if you have, especially American citizens, if you look at the situation with ISIS, and we're supposed to be this massive, God-fearing superpower military of the world, why can we not defeat a group of ragtag, people that are supposedly cave dwellers? I mean, let's put this in proper perspective. I mean, we're supposed to have all of these technological, super advanced weapons, but yet we can't find, locate, and dislodge a group of people that are hanging out in caves. That don't even make sense. How can that add up?
And it's just another aspect of the absurdity. On the one hand, we have the mainstream propaganda machine continually belittling and dehumanizing these supposed terrorists, with the metaphor, of course, that you've used about them, quote unquote, living in caves, and projecting them as the most primitive barbarians. And yet we have the most sophisticated war machine the world has ever seen, not able to be one step ahead of supposed primitive barbarians. And it's utter absurdity. Of course, we know the power and potency of the surveillance machine that's been trained on our own populations. We have total Big Brother system where an ant can't cross a road without its movement being spotted and recorded. And yet, with the same technological capability which can be projected to any part in the world, we have the U.S. government feigning impotence in dealing with this, minor cabal of thugs and mercenaries. It's total absurdity from every possible angle of examination. But as we were getting to before, as you were getting to before, the purpose of creating this false paradigm could very, very easily be as a pretext for another war, based on some new 9/11 or some other fabricated event?
I think it's coming. I mean, because like I said, you had Paris. Actually, you could argue going all the way back to San Bernardino, and then Paris, obviously, and now Brussels. And each one has gotten more violent and a little bit larger in scale. And now, so where does it go? I mean, it just seems like it's kind of escalating and escalating and escalating until, and with Russia saying that we're done. We're done with Syria. We did what we said we were going to do. We're pulling out, but don't think that we're gone, because we can get right back in there, quote, in a matter of hours, and be right back where we were. So, we've set everything up for you guys, so let's deal with it, make it happen.
But let me just backtrack a little further here to review the history. When this phony war on terror was first invented after the 9/11 false flag event, we were told very clearly why the U.S. war machine was being cut loose to rampage around the world. And George Jr. put it in very simple terms for us. We're fighting them over there, so we don't have to fight them over here. And, of course, along with that mantra, for the first several years of this phony war, the only events which ever occurred within the West, which was supposedly being protected because the U.S. Army was rampaging everywhere else, were attacks that were, quote unquote, caught at the last minute. And we had a string of these supposed almost terrorist attacks. And of course, in every single case, it was the most comical wannabes who were the supposed terrorists. And the attacks they were planning were juvenile, if not infantile. And, the possibility of any of these feeble, quote unquote, terrorist attacks succeeding was almost nil. And, we had a long string of these silly almost attacks for several years. Unfortunately, as is the case with any form of lying and propaganda and deception, you can't continue to use the same forms of lies over and over again. Eventually, the almost attacks no longer had any effect on us. We no longer would believe the war on terror was real simply because of these comical almost attacks. And so they had to escalate things. They had to start creating a real body count. They had to start murdering people here and not just pretending they were about to murder them. And so now we've seen the escalation to successful terrorist attacks in our regimes, apparently whenever the terrorists feel like it. And then, of course, we have to ask ourselves the question, why were we ever fighting them over there, quote unquote, if we couldn't stop them from coming over here, quote unquote? All we would accomplish by dropping bombs on the heads of millions and millions of Muslims again and again and again is to make them angry. And this brings us to the other aspect of fighting any form of terrorism. If you want to be successful against terrorism, you treat it as a crime and you use the police against the terrorists in order to engage in surgical strike enforcement. Because that's the way the police work. The police don't drop bombs.
Right.
If you want to create terrorism, you turn the army loose against it, because the army, by definition, is not capable of that sort of surgical correction of problems. They do drop bombs. And so if you turn the army loose against quote-unquote terrorism, the only possible outcome is more terrorism. So the moment that our corrupt governments announced that they were going to exclusively treat terrorism as a military matter and exclusively use their armies to combat it, with the police in a subordinate role, we knew that the goal of these corrupt regimes was not to stop terrorism, it was to create terrorism. So the war on terror was, in fact, the war to create terror.
Correct. I mean, that's, and seeing, once again, I want to go back to what Trump and Sanders are doing, and in particular Donald Trump. Love him, hate him, doesn't matter to me. Vote for him, don't vote for him. I really don't care. What I'm concerned with is what he's saying. And what he is saying is we need to stop this. We need to get a handle on this war on terror. We need to get a handle on at home. We need to get a handle on our base, on the United States, and forget this other stuff. And we need to talk to Putin, and we need to talk to these other world leaders, and not just drop bombs on them. I mean, so I think that plays into the escalation of what we're seeing right now. Because if my theory holds any water, then they're going to have to speed up their timelines. And a lot of people are saying that we're not going to get to the 2016 election. And how do you feel about that? I mean, are you seeing or hearing anything along those lines, or reading anything along those lines?
Well, first, with respect to Donald Trump, I totally understand your own perspective, and my perspective is very similar. But let me express it in a slightly different way. Most of your audience will be familiar with the fable of the emperor's new clothes. And it's the fable about a vain and corrupt emperor who gets his, the finest tailor in the kingdom to supposedly weave him the finest suit of clothes. But in fact, there are no clothes. The emperor walks out naked in front of his people. And while all of the sycophants in the population are applauding the emperor's new clothes, one little boy stands up and shouts out, "The emperor is wearing no clothes," and only then do the sycophants acknowledge what they're actually seeing with their own eyes. Donald Trump is that little boy. Donald Trump is continually standing up and shouting, "The emperor is wearing no clothes." And he did it with regard to U.S. corruption. He's done it with respect to the phony war on terror. I was shocked to see another headline today. Donald Trump is saying the U.S. doesn't have any gold in Fort Knox. So, once again, this is, the boy shouting, "The emperor has no clothes." He's not saying anything we don't know. It's just that for once, somebody who people will actually listen to is saying it.
Exactly.
And so he performs a very useful function in that respect, whether or not he's been corrupted, whether or not, or regardless of what he would actually do if when he gets elected. At the moment, he is the little boy who's pointing out all of these things that no one else will say, even though it's patently obvious. And sorry, so getting back to your general suggestion of what's coming, yeah, I don't see any reason not to look at that as the probable course of events, because of course when we combine this with the fact that there is an economic crash that's coming, it's coming very soon. The banksters need to reset our economy so that they can start the next bubble and crash cycle. We have everything lined up to expect some sort of large exogenous event, whether it's going to be a terrorist false flag attack, whether it's going to be some new plague unleashed upon us. It's going to cause massive disruption in our economies. We can strongly suspect some sort of exogenous event, but we even here we can't be 100% sure of it, because of course we're projecting into the future as rational individuals, and we're not dealing with rational individuals or a rational system. Mm-hmm. Perhaps these psychopathic bankers are so audacious that they don't even think they need to create a pretext for their next crash, and they're just simply going to do it on purely economic terms. We can't rule that out completely. It's just that there seems to have been a lot of information telegraphed that, quote unquote, something big is planned. And so when you and I look at the events that are unfolding, we suspect that is what's coming next and coming soon.
And it's their pattern for a couple of hundred years, if not more, is to create this huge distraction by way of war, and then start resetting everything as far as economics and finance are concerned.
In the fog of war.
In the fog of war, exactly. When no one can see the criminals moving about. when they're all watching the body count instead of watching the criminals resetting everything and going, well, why are you doing that right now when we've got this situation going on over here? We got all these people being blown up, but you're talking about doing something with the money. Well, why aren't you concerned about this? And see, and that's what we need. That's what we need, people that are going to be doing that. We need people like Donald Trump that will say that, and people will listen to him, because you and I can say it all day long, and it's great. I mean, and it's great that we're going to be informing a few people, but that's where it's going to start and stop. It's going to be a few people. We'll say 10,000. I mean, if 10,000 people watch this video, then that's great. But that's only 10,000, where Donald Trump is reaching millions. And that's where we need it to be. We need somebody out there that will say, why are you counting money when my children are dying? And that, and until that happens, these criminals will.
But here's what surprises me a little bit, Rory. If we go back to the last election cycle, when Ron Paul was a leading candidate, and when Ron Paul was attempting to do a lot of the things that Donald Trump is doing now, which is bring attention to some of the major injustices and major flaws in our current paradigm, what did we see the mainstream media do at that time? Well, we saw them essentially just censor Dr. Paul.
Yes.
They cut off his access to the media and did everything possible to discredit him and to conceal everything he was trying to tell us. And so this is the part that strikes me strange with regard to the current U.S. election, is either the oligarchs were caught totally off guard by the phenomenon of the Donald, or they're deliberately allowing him to vent like this. And if that's the case, I scratch my head, because I don't see any clear agenda to allow something like that. The whole point with the emperor's new clothes is it's really important to the emperor that somebody shut up that little boy before he says anything. And yet here we have the little boy allowed to stand up and shout, not just once or twice, but again and again about all sorts of different things. The emperor's wearing no clothes. The emperor's lying to us. The emperor's stealing from us. This just seems totally atypical, once again, talking about the patterns we're used to seeing in this paradigm of corruption.
It does make one scratch their head and go, what's different? Because you're absolutely right. I mean, and we're seeing some of the same things play out during this cycle, and that happened to Dr. Paul. And
now, of course, there is. Sorry.
No, I mean, he was shut out, or his delegates were shut out of the Republican National Convention in Florida. They were locked out, created all this chaos. And now they're talking about locking out the delegates for Donald Trump, or just ignoring them completely. We don't recognize them. I mean, and it's like, how can you do that? How can you say that my vote doesn't count? And
okay, now I'm not familiar with this. Sorry.
No, we've had two different people within the GOP to come out and say point blank that your vote really doesn't matter. It doesn't count. We decide who the delegates are going to choose. They've come out and said that twice. Once was the first time was live on CNBC.
And how recently was this, Rory?
Within the last week.
Okay, very recent now. Okay, yeah, I was going to say I hadn't picked up on that myself. So okay, well that could suggest then that the Donald really was a surprise, which the oligarchs weren't prepared for, and now they're engaging in damage control belatedly. But of course, I was going to point out there is one very key difference between and there's many, of course, but there's one very key difference between Ron Paul and Donald Trump, and that is that Ron Paul is utterly uncorruptible.
Yes.
And, of course, Donald Trump is the personification of corruption. He's just not, as far as we know, in the pocket of the same oligarchs who are controlling everything else. Well, one other difference here is that different people are listening to the Donald than the people who are listening to Ron Paul. The people who were listening to Ron Paul were people like ourselves, and generally, I would dare say, the more intelligent and sophisticated segments of the U.S. population, the people who were most likely to start scratching their heads and asking themselves what's really going on here. In contrast, if we look at the Donald's popular support, we go right down to the level of the lowliest knuckle draggers. We're generally dealing with the elements of our zombie populations who are most apathetic, least informed, and greatest in number. And so we have the Donald appealing to a very broad segment of the population right off the bat. Whereas with Ron Paul, he was starting off with a smaller base of supporters and people who understand where he was coming from, and then there was the potential for that to mushroom into something much larger. So because of that different dynamic, it may have seemed a lot more practical to simply